has been said times over that all the stories told form links in a chain that has no beginning and no end. There's no doubt by now that you know what these links contain and even can delineate their segments. But perhaps also you've gleaned that there is that which runs through this chain. It's nothing. It's emptiness. And perhaps you've even realized that this emptiness itself has no beginning and no end. So what is the relationship, we can ask, between the chain, its links, and that which runs through it? But that's for another time. Sometimes stories arise that do not seem to fit into the context of a particular link. And this is one of those stories. Let's see what it evokes in us and for us in its telling or retelling. It's a Scottish story. It's the story of that time when a fisherman, rowing his boat into shore after a day out in the wide ocean, just as the sun's rays were spotlighting points on the shore, one of those rays illuminated a rocky outcrop rising above the sandy beach. And as the fisherman looked, he saw a form. Immediately he rowed his boat into the shore and climbed the outcrop and came to the ledge on which lay a maiden. Hair like burnished gold covering her face, her body skewed as a result of the obvious fall. Carefully, he removed the golden hair from her face to find a pallid maiden. He put his face close to hers, feeling that there was still breath, there was still life. So he lifted her gently and carried her down, saying to himself, I must take her back to be tended to by my wife. When he arrived at his house, and they lay the maiden down on a pallet, examined by the wife of the fisherman, it was found that there were no broken bones, many abrasions, bruises, but keeping her warm, giving her that which is life itself, the water to wet her lips. After some while, she awoke, and flailing around, she immediately said, my babe, where is my bairn? Where is my child, my son? But they quieted her down, trying to placate her. But then, as she came to full consciousness, her tears flowed. I left my baby by the side in a crevice while I went for water. I must find him. They tried to keep her quiet. She was still very weak. And the fisherman said, "Do not disturb yourself. I will go to seek your child." So, taking some neighbors, he went out in the dark of night, and they looked through the whole area but found no wee child. When he came back and gave this news, the maiden was distraught. "I must find my child. I lost my parents. I lost my husband. I cannot lose my baby." So even though they tried to deter her, she arose and left to begin her quest to find her child, her infant baby. She went from place to place, but no one had found or heard of a lost infant. She slept under trees, in the forest, by streams, until one day she came into a little clearing where there was gathered a group of gypsies, their caravans in a circle, obviously as is the way of gypsies, although nomadic, knowing where they were going. They took her in, bathed her swollen feet, and gave her soup to drink. She told them her story, begging, "Can you help me?" But they said, "We are on our way to join another caravan, and in that caravan there is an old woman who is said to be wise. Come with us." And so she followed them to their next place, where they united with another group of gypsies, and she was taken to the place where an old woman sat on the steps of her caravan, wrinkled face, gazing down at that which was in her lap, the weaving that some gypsies do. She was invited to come and sit beside the old crone. The old crone looked up at her and said, "My child, you carry a great burden of sadness. Tell me." And so the maiden told her tale, the loss, the death of her mother and father, her marriage to her lover, a farmer, the joy they felt when they were with child, but the sadness when her husband was taken by a fever, and now her quest to find her child. The old woman commiserated with the maiden. The maiden begged her, "Please, won't you help me?" The old woman took out what seemed to be the sand from somewhere, the dust from who knows where, and threw it under the fire that was burning close by. As the smoke arose, the old woman gazed into it and said, "Oh, there is good and bad news. Your child is still alive, but has been taken by the fairy people." "Oh," said the maiden, "won't you help me to get my son back?" The old woman said, "I know the ways of nature, but I do not know the ways of the magic of the fairy people." But the maiden begged her, "Please, please, won't you help me?" So that night, while the maiden slept, the old woman sat by the fire, feeding the dust, and as the smoke arose, filling her, in the morning, she was able to relate to the maiden that indeed her son was with the fairy people, and that the way to find and reclaim him would need the maiden to call on all that was known and unknown in her to enable her to reclaim her child. And the old crone told her, "The fairy people have the ability to make magic, to make spells, but they have no practical knowledge. Those things that become precious to them have to be stolen." And so the old crone said to the maiden, "You must find 2 things of great significance, unusual things that will capture the imagination of the fairy people. One which will give you entry into their enclave, and the other which will enable you to claim your child back." The old crone then gave the maiden some ointment, some emolument, which she rubbed on her eyes and said, "This will enable you to see the fairy people." And then she placed her hands over the head of the maiden and invoked the wind, the water, the air, and the fire, the forces of nature, to come to her aid. And then the maiden went on her way. As she walked, she looked deep, deep into herself, drawing on those things from her childhood, the myths, the fairy tales, her own glimmerings seen in the forests, and she knew what she had to do. Immediately she made her way down to the seashore, and there, in little crevices, she found the down of the birds, and she gathered it to herself. She found a cave, and she secreted these feathers, not blown by the wind. The wind was her friend. the down was protected in the cave. And then she took a knife and cut off her long hair, and painstakingly she wove a cloak. The burnished gold of her hair glistening amongst the downy feathers, making the cloak so light that even the breath lifted it, so that it became like wings floating. Placing it carefully in the cave, she went out again, and hunting along the edge of the ocean, she came to the whitened bones of a sea creature, and carefully separating them, she was able to form the frame of an instrument. Was it a lute? Was it a harp? Was it a lyre? But in any event, she used the last strands of her golden hair to form the strings of this instrument. Then, gathering up the cloak and the harp, she set out to find what the old crone had told her, the 3 rings, which indicated that this was the place, the entry to the enclave of the fairy people. She was ready, waiting, as she was told, for the rays of the sun to diminish. She heard the sound, and there, as she remained hidden, came the troop of fairy beings. They chanted, and suddenly, behind the rings, the 3 rings, there was an opening, and they began to trail in. But just as the last of these little people entered, the maiden revealed herself, the cloak around her shoulders. This was seen by the last, an old fairy who said, "What are you doing, human, here?" And then the fairy caught sight of the cloak as the wind lifted it, and its golden threads shone. And the fairy said, "I want that cloak." But of course the maiden said, "You cannot have it. Only if you allow me entry into this place can it be yours." But of course the fairy bargained, but the maiden stood firm until finally it was too much. The covetousness of the fairy who wanted this incredible cloak said the words that allowed the aperture to be opened, and they gained entry. Inside, the other fairies gathered around and said, "What's this human doing here?" But then the light captured the cloak, now around the shoulders of the old fairy, and they were distracted, squabbling amongst themselves for this beautiful thing. In this way, the maiden was allowed to make her way down to the front of the gathering, where there was the throne of the newly installed fairy king. She boldly stood in front of the throne, and taking the harp, her fingers playing across its strings, a melody full of the sadness of her longing. The ears of the fairy king caught the sounds, and he too stated his desire to have this instrument. But of course the maiden refused. The king got angry, demanding it be given into his possession. But the maiden merely played more of the tune that evoked in all the fairies, mesmerized by the melancholy, the somberness, the longing in the melody, until the king asked, "What is the price of this instrument?" And the maiden said, "My son." At first the king was reluctant. This human child was part of the bounty that brought him to the throne. But the music had done its work, and the child was brought, placed into the maiden's arms. The harp dropped at the feet of the fairy king, who immediately picked it up and started to play one of those tunes famous and known and heard at times from the fairy realms. And in this way the maiden was able to carry her beloved son and escape that enclave. She made her way out of that place, finding her way to the place in which she would come to rest. Perhaps we can finish this story for ourselves. Where is it that the maiden, reunited with her beloved son, was able to come to rest, so that as her son grew, there was harmony, there was abundance, there was peace as the time passed and he grew to manhood. What is the meaning of this story for us? Is it the quest, the calling that drove us on? How do we know? Is it a reuniting with something beloved that ends that quest? Where is it that we come to rest? What is it that brings the elements of stillness and nature, and innate knowing, and history, and culture, all together, now? What does this story evoke for you?